But I think it is a matter of huge regret that 2.5 years in, Western industry isn't just pumping huge amounts of military materiel into Ukraine each month.
What's your understanding of the criticism here? Because if you read the piece in the Times by about the former foreign minister of Ukraine, he talks about kind of general sense, and then he talks about one unpleasant meeting, which was over Storm Shadow. So, what do you think it's actually about? Is it a kind of sense, or is it specific issues?
I think what happened there was emblematic of a wider trend that they've seen since Labour has come into power. If you remember, there was this issue over whether or not to use Storm Shadow, these long-range missiles, to hit into Russia. And the British policy under Starmer, under the Labour government, was basically to wait until the Americans said yes. And as soon as President Biden said it was fine for the Ukrainians to use ATACMS, which is another type of ballistic missile, to fire into Russia, Britain went ahead and gave the approval to use Storm Shadow 2. Now, that is the opposite to earlier in the war, where British foreign policy basically kind of led the world on, for example, giving tanks. We were the first country to give tanks, giving long-range missiles in the first place. So if you look at the total volume of support given to Ukraine, Britain is behind the US, behind Germany. But what it has done is, at various crucial points in the war, unlock higher levels of support by taking a risk, essentially, and proving to the US, proving to other countries that there isn't this risk of escalation by giving, for example, tanks or whatever it is that Russia says is going to provoke a nuclear war or whatever their threat is going to be.
Now, you're in Kyiv. I'm not sure how you would measure this, but what do you kind of perceive about attitudes towards Keir Starmer, towards the current government, in relation to people like Boris Johnson and, to an extent, Rishi Sunak?
Well, Boris Johnson is always going to be cherished here because of what he did earlier in the war. And I think they're still kind of sussing out Starmer, but, it's notable, for example, that he still hasn't been to Ukraine. And for example, Boris Johnson was obviously the first Western leader to go to Ukraine. Liz Truss didn't really last long enough to make a visit, but Rishi Sunak, as soon as he came in, he made a big show of going there quickly to demonstrate continued support. Now, while Starmer has met Zelensky, at various summits around the world, he has not gone to Ukraine, and that's a kind of it is symbolic. It is felt here.
That's very interesting. George, thank you. It's George Grills. He is the Times' defence correspondent. He's speaking to us from Kyiv. We can also speak now to James Heappey, the former defence minister. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
These criticisms that come from Dmytro Kuleba and also there from Alexei Goncharenko, that Keir Starmer, for whatever reason, is just not as engaged in Ukraine as previous prime ministers were. Do you think that's fair?
No. I think I can see where the Ukrainians are coming from. And, it is interesting, as George Grills just said, that Keir Starmer hasn't been to Kyiv yet. Now, I know in the article that is in the Times today, Number 10 have pointed out that I think there have been 6 times when the PM has met Zelensky, but that's not quite the same as being there and showing your solidarity on the streets of Kyiv or Odessa or even further forward still. And so that is remiss. On the other hand, it's hard to see, Asma, where exactly UK leadership on sort of pushing through a capability threshold next would be. The reality is that 2.5 years into the war, we are giving the Ukrainians incredibly sophisticated weapon systems. But the reality is that everybody, well, the United States included, is limited on quantity because so many of our stockpiles have already been exhausted. And industry still, and you could discuss whether or not this is a failing of the West, but the Western defense industry still isn't manufacturing at the scale that we might have expected in order to be able to support Ukraine from that.
Do you sense a change right now? Because there's a lot of things happening right now. Obviously, President Biden approving those missiles, Donald Trump imminently arriving in the White House, this criticism of Keir Starmer compared to previous governments. Something's clearly happening. And obviously, it's a bit of a waiting game, really, isn't it, until January until we find out what, Donald Trump's particular plan is in terms of continuing to support Ukraine or not. Does that explain why we're in a slightly, I don't know what the word is, nebulous time, really, when it comes to attitudes towards Ukraine? Or is it clearer to you?
Well, no, it's far from clear for me in terms of why we're not maintaining the momentum of our gifting. Like I said, I don't think that is anything that any one country could do with its existing stockpiles, but I think it is a matter of huge regret that 2.5 years in, Western industry isn't just pumping huge amounts of military materiel into Ukraine each month. But you can't undo that now. It is the way that it is. I think that what is very significant about the moment that we're in is, Trump has made clear what he thinks he's going to do when he comes to power, and his special envoy, Kellogg, is clearly already at work in delivering that. I was interested to see Emmanuel Macron convene Zelensky and Trump together last month. We don't know what the conversations were behind closed doors, but the French have always had an instinct towards trading territory for peace, even if that was not what the Ukrainians wanted to do. And that was one of the key things that British prime ministers have stood against over the last 2.5 years. This idea that the peace is defined by anything but the will of President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, because that is fundamentally the sovereignty that they are fighting for. So I wonder if what Dmitry Kuleba and others are now talking about is not UK thought leadership in terms of the next military capability, but UK thought leadership in terms of the absolute centrality of Ukrainian sovereignty to the peace outcome, to the peace process that will now unfold. And that will require a lot of bravery on the part of the British government if that is the role that Keir Starmer chooses to take, because it will be potentially at odds with Washington and Paris. But it is a really important bit of advocacy that I think the Ukrainians will require the Brits to do on their behalf, so that whatever peace comes, if that's what Trump decides to do, is something that has Ukrainian sovereignty at its core, is not something that the West inflicts on Ukraine because it's expedient.
So 2025 is going to bring an end to the war between Ukraine and Russia, you would say?
I honestly don't know, Asma. I fear that there could be an end to the war imposed on Ukraine that Putin banks as something akin to a victory, and that then emboldens him and turbocharges the threat to Euro-Atlantic security for a generation or more beyond. That worries me enormously. That the sort of, and the danger is that the incoming administration think that Afghanistan was the playbook. And if you remember, they made this deal called the Doha Agreement 2 years before the end of Western troops being in Afghanistan. But what they thought was a very expedient peace deal that guaranteed no further loss of American life and Western life in Afghanistan, and sort of saw a route out of the country. What that ended up doing was setting a non-conditions based exit that has led to Afghanistan almost completely reverting to how it was prior to the Western involvement there beginning. And there's a real danger that what might seem as a quick fix, that you can just impose a peace on Ukraine, fix the conflict on its current front lines. The Ukraine trades territory for peace, but that what that does is fundamentally undermines Euro-Atlantic security for years to come.
Yes.
The way to avoid that, and this is where the UK could be incredibly brave as a thought leader, the way to avoid that is to insist that if a territory for peace deal is to be recommended by the West, and if Zelensky is reluctantly to take it, we support Zelensky in making Ukrainian NATO membership immediate as part of that peace deal. And that really would guarantee the security of Ukraine for decades to come.
Okay.
And most importantly, it would be the strategic defeat of Putin as well.
Very interesting. James Heapy, thank you very much. He is, of course, the former defence minister.